Hello, I'm Per. In this video we're going to visit Tyreso Slott, a beautiful old castle in Tyresö, a large municipality southeast of Stockholm. Tyreso Slott was built for the great statesman Gabriel Oxenstierna in the first half of the 17th century. It lies close to Kallfjärden, a bay in the Baltic Sea, and is surrounded by a big beautiful park. There is also a church nearby, built shortly after the castle, and we're going to take a look at the church too. If you want to see the interior of the castle, you will have to take a guided tour, and what you will see is how it looked inside when the last private proprietors, the Lagergren family, lived here. But before we step inside, I will talk about the history of the castle. Let's go back to the beginning, and I would like to put this in its historical context. By the way, I will consistently use the Swedish pronunciation of names in this video, for example, Gabriel instead of Gabriel. Gustav Adolf Vasa, grandson of Gustav Vasa, became king of Sweden in 1611. He wanted to expand Sweden and protect the Protestants on the European continent from the Catholic Empire of Habsburg. In 1628, he took Sweden into the big German war, later called the 30 Years' War. In 1630, he took farewell of Riksdagen, the Swedish parliament, and shortly after that, he landed with his troops in Germany. He was successful at first, but in 1632, he was killed in the Battle of Lutzen. The Swedish troops won the battle despite the loss of their supreme commander. When Gustav Adolf had died, his daughter Christina became Queen of Sweden, but she was only 5 years old and could not rule the country at that age. Instead, Count Axel Oxenstierna, Lord High Chancellor of Sweden, became head of the Regency Council that governed Sweden. As Axel Oxenstierna was serving as supreme commander of the Swedish troops in Germany, his younger brother Gabriel had to step in for him in the Regency Council and rule Sweden until his brother returned in 1636. Gabriel inherited a large property in Tyresö in 1624, but started the construction of the castle already in 1620. The construction of the castle was completed in 1636. The same year that Gabriel stepped down from his position in the government. We do not know for certain who the architect was. This copper plate by French engraver Nicolas Perel, based on a drawing by Erik Dahlberg from 1661, gives us a good idea of how the castle originally looked. Gabriel Oxenstierna died in 1640. When Gabriel Oxenstierna died, his son Gustav inherited Tyreso Slott. When Gustav died in 1648, his widow Countess Maria Sofia de la Gardie became the sole proprietor of Tyreso Slott. She started some small factories and workshops around the castle, but her business was not very profitable. The government of King Carl XI seized properties from the nobility through the Great Reduction of 1680, and Maria Sofia eventually went bankrupt in 1687, but she did not lose all her property. After the death of Maria Sofia de la Gardie in 1694, her granddaughter Maria Gustava Gyllenstierna inherited Tyreso Slott. One important event in the history of the castle occurred during her time as proprietor. In 1719, in the final stages of the Great Nordic War, Russian navy ships rampaged the Stockholm archipelago. Countess Gyllenstierna, the then proprietor of the castle, took down the towers of the castle to trick the Russians, and it worked. When the barbarians from the east sailed into the bay here and saw the castle without towers, they thought that it had already been attacked and destroyed, so they turned their ships around and sailed out of the bay. In the 1770s, Carl Fredrik Schäffer, then proprietor of Tyreso Slott, hired the landscape architect Fredrik Magnus Pieper to create an English landscape park around the castle. Pieper also created the royal park Hagaparken near Stockholm and the park at the Drottningholm Palace. You can see parts of those parks in some of my other videos. This is a part of the English landscape park surrounding the castle. Beautiful, isn't it? Tyreso Slott was passed on as inheritance until the late 18th century when it was sold. It changed hands a couple of times in the 19th century, but I'm gonna jump to the last private proprietors of the castle, the Lagergren family. Claes Lagergren grew up on an estate in the countryside in the Swedish province Närke. In his youth, he studied at the Franz Chateau Institute of Trade in Stockholm. In 1875 he went to France, and in 1876 he started to work for a corporation there that exported wines to Sweden. He sometimes traveled to Italy, and in 1880 he converted to Catholicism in Rome, something that was very unusual and not really accepted in the Protestant Sweden at that time. Pope Leo XIII made him a papal chambellan in 1884 and conferred to him the rank of Marquis in 1889. In the late 19th century, many rich Americans traveled to Europe, and some of them got married there. Caroline Russell was the daughter of successful and wealthy businessman Charles Handy Russell and his wife Caroline. She grew up in Newport on Rhode Island, but the family later moved to Manhattan in New York City and kept the house in Newport as their summer place. Caroline's father Charles died in 1884 and left a large inheritance to his children. Caroline traveled to Europe in 1890 and arrived in Rome in January 1891. Claes and Caroline met in Rome and got engaged shortly after that. Caroline converted to Catholicism and they got married in Rome on the 6th of May the same year. They went to Sweden to look for a home and acquired Tyreso Slott in 1892. It was Caroline's fortune that made this purchase possible and enabled them to rebuild and maintain the castle. Claes and Caroline also had an apartment in central Stockholm. In the winters they would live in the city or travel abroad, but they always called Tyreso Slott their home. The couple got 3 sons, Claes, Johan and Carl. Claes worked in Rome part of the year, and Caroline assumed responsibility for managing the property and the family's finances. She was also very clear about this to her husband Claes, that he had to let her do it without any interference. This also meant that she was the boss of the staff at the castle. The number of people working at the castle varied with the seasons. There were more of them in the summer than in the winter. The staff included many categories of personnel, for example a chef, a housekeeper and maids, a bookkeeper, cattlemen and farm workers, and even a blacksmith and a carpenter, and they often had to work long hours. Child labor was common in Sweden in the early 20th century, and it occurred here at Tyreso Slott as well. Caroline would sometimes throw parties for the children of the members of the staff and give them presents to show her appreciation and cheer them up. In the 1970s, as part of a research project, the Nordic Museum did interviews with old members of the staff and their children. From those interviews, it appears that Caroline was a more kind and considerate person than her husband Claes, and for this reason more popular among the staff. Although Caroline liked it out here, she missed her home country and her friends and family over there. She died of a stroke in 1919. In 1922, 3 years after Caroline's death, Claes married Mary Sherman, a rich widow from New York and an old friend of Caroline's. Her fortune made it possible for Claes to continue to rebuild and maintain the castle. Claes died in 1930, and in accordance with his last will and testament, Mary left the estate to the Nordic Museum Foundation in 1932. Tyreso Slott was opened to the public as a museum the same year. Mary died in 1933. Now let's take a walk inside the castle. This is the breakfast room, where the Lagergren family also kept a part of their large collection of books. This is the library, and it was also Claes' office. This room is called the Emperor's Parlor. Claes and his friends would sometimes sit down here to smoke and have conversations. The Lagergren family had so many books that they had to spread them out in several rooms. This is the large dining hall. This is the tower parlor, where the Lagergren family often had afternoon tea, by themselves or with their friends. Here, portraits of Claes and Caroline hang next to each other. And here is a room filled with portraits of family and friends. This is the blue parlor. It is one of the biggest rooms in the castle and was often used for receptions. This is the yellow parlor, and it was also used for receptions. This was Caroline's bedroom. Claes' second wife Mary used the same bedroom. Mary had one condition for moving to Tyresö, that she would get a modern bathroom. The bathroom she got was state-of-the-art at that time and would be acceptable even today. The floor and the hand basin are made of white marble, and the walls are covered with stucco lustro, an old technique to imitate marble. Stoves like these were common in Swedish homes in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Gabriel Oxenstierna founded a congregation in Tyresö in 1636 and had a church built for it a couple of years later. The Tyresö church was built during the years 1638 to 1640. The first service in this church took place on the 9th of March in 1641, and it was the funeral of Gabriel Oxenstierna. About 2,000 people, headed by Queen Christina, walked all the way from Stockholm to this church for the funeral, and after the funeral they had a grave feast that lasted for 2 days. That is, they drank beer for 2 days. That must have been quite a funeral party. and I reckon they must have been tired after that long walk and all that beer. In 1740, a stroke of lightning set the tower of the church on fire and it burned down. The tower was never rebuilt to its original height. This is the pulpit in the church. And this is Gabriel Oxenstiernas mausoleum. The organ was built in 1842 and reconstructed and improved in 1932. Claes and Caroline gathered many prominent guests, members of the cultural elite in Sweden at that time, out here in Tyreso in the summers. One of them was Prince Eugen, a colonel in the Swedish army and a very talented painter who had studied art in Paris. Prince Eugen wanted to buy a small piece of land and build a summer house for himself here in Tyreso. But that turned out to be too expensive even for a prince. So instead he made a deal with Claes Lagergren about renting this house. The prince spent his summers out here for 18 years in a row, from 1894 to 1912. And the house got the name Prinsvillan, the Prince's Villa. Many of his friends came to see him and be with him out here in the summer. A colony of artists. Prince Eugen made some very beautiful paintings out here in Tyreso, and I'm going to show you some of them now. This is Foldringsströmmen, a small creek near Prinsvillan. Fishing is not allowed here, but it would have been interesting as sea trout living in the Baltic Sea can wander up in small streams like this one. If you walk through the park here down to the water, you will see a small island, Notholmen, connected to the mainland by a bridge. There is a hostel and a very nice little cafe on the island. Notholmen's Cafe is a perfect place to have lunch or afternoon coffee in the summer while getting a sample of the beautiful Stockholm archipelago. There's also a guest harbor here on the island, what you see behind me. On a warm and sunny day like this, you can catch some rays on the shores and cool off with a swim. There should be good fishing here too. I saw an angler with his rod just minutes ago. There is also a very nice cafe and a courtyard where you can have lunch or afternoon coffee outdoors. On a terrace on the west wing, you'll find Tyreso Slott, an exclusive restaurant with a lovely view over the park. However, this restaurant is open primarily for group reservations. But if you're traveling with a group, it may be possible to make a reservation in advance. You can easily get to Tyreso Slott by bus from Stockholm, but you'll have to walk a few hundred meters from the bus stop. If you want to see the interior of the castle, you will have to take a guided tour, and guided tours are booked in advance. If you're going to visit Tyreso Slott, I suggest to spend a full day out here, take a guided tour of the castle, take a walk in the park, and have lunch at one of the nice restaurants out here. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching.